Touch everything except that room. Ethan Whitmore's voice cut through the foyer before Naomi Carter had even set her cleaning toe on the polished marble floor. The words were sharp, clipped, practiced, like something he'd repeated enough times to make it law. Naomi looked up slowly. He stood at the top of the sweeping staircase in a charcoal sweater and pressed slacks, one hand resting on the banister, the other curled around a half-empty coffee mug gone cold. He was taller than she expected, older than the magazines made him look. Handsome in the way men became handsome when grief hollowed them out and left only the hard edges behind. His eyes flicked toward the West Wing hallway, toward a white door at the very end that stood shut beneath a crystal sconce. "Understood, sir," Naomi said softly. Ethan gave one curt nod, then turned and disappeared before she could say anything else. The front door clicked shut behind his assistant, leaving her alone inside the mansion with silence so heavy it felt upholstered. Naomi stood still for a moment, taking it in. The house was enormous, at least 12,000 square feet if her guess was right. 3 levels, vaulted ceilings, imported chandeliers, floor-to-ceiling windows framing acres of manicured land outside. It should have felt grand. Instead, it felt cold. Not elegant cold, empty cold, like no one had laughed here in a very long time. Dust clung to the edges of the crown molding despite the gleaming floors. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish, old books, and something sadder beneath it all, like stale cologne trapped in curtains that never got opened. Naomi adjusted the strap on her bag and got to work. She always started the same way. Kitchen first, then common areas, then shelves and details. Organization wasn't just about cleaning. It was about restoring order to places people had let fall apart. But within 15 minutes, she understood this house wasn't messy because its owner was careless. It was messy because he had stopped caring. Bills lay unopened in neat stacks on the kitchen island. Mail dated 3 months back. A vase of dead roses still sat on the breakfast table, petals browned and curled inward. One dining chair was slightly pulled out, as if someone had once stood there and never returned to push it back in. Naomi touched the back of the chair gently before moving on. In the study, she found shelves lined with business awards and framed magazine covers featuring Ethan's face beside headlines calling him the youngest real estate mogul in New England. But every personal photograph in the room had been turned face down. Every single one. Her chest tightened. People only did that when the memory hurt too much to look at. By noon she had reorganized the pantry, sorted the mountain of unopened packages by date, and folded enough abandoned throw blankets to stock a department store. Yet the deeper she moved through the mansion, the more she felt it, that strange tension in the walls, as if the whole house were holding its breath. Around 1 o'clock, she heard footsteps behind her. Ethan entered the kitchen, loosened tie now hanging from one hand, brows furrowed when he noticed the counters clear for the first time in what looked like months. "You moved things." Naomi turned. "Only clutter, sir." His gaze scanned the room. "I knew where everything was." Naomi nodded once. "Then I can put it back if you'd prefer." He stared at her for a beat too long. Then his shoulders lowered. Not much, but enough to matter. "No," he muttered. "Leave it." He opened the refrigerator, stared inside without taking anything, then shut it again. Naomi returned to wiping the counter, pretending not to notice when his eyes drifted toward the hallway, toward that closed white door at the end of the West Wing. His jaw flexed. Then he walked away. That night, as Naomi packed her things near the front entry, she heard it. A sound so quiet she nearly missed it. Not a voice. Not footsteps. Just the muffled crack of something breaking somewhere upstairs, followed by silence so abrupt it made her skin prickle. She froze, heart thudding. Then slowly, from the second floor, she heard the sound that made her stop breathing for half a second. A man crying. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just one broken sound, quickly swallowed, like someone ashamed to let the walls hear it. Naomi looked up toward the darkened staircase, her hand tightening around the strap of her bag. And for the first time since entering the Whitmore mansion, she understood the truth. Ethan Whitmore had not hired her because his house was disorganized. He had hired her because his life was. The next morning, Naomi arrived just before 8, the sky outside still washed pale gray with the last of the dawn mist clinging to the Whitmore estate. The gates opened automatically as her sedan rolled through, and the mansion rose ahead of her like some beautiful thing abandoned by time. Inside, the silence greeted her again before anyone else did. Not the peaceful kind of silence. The strained kind. The kind that settled into walls after too much sorrow had been left unspoken. She had barely set down her coat when Mrs. Delaney, the house manager, appeared from the service corridor carrying a clipboard against her chest. She was a silver-haired woman in her 60s with the posture of someone who had spent decades mastering the art of saying little and seeing everything. "You are early," she said. "I like mornings." Naomi offered a polite smile. Mrs. Delaney studied her for a moment, then lowered her voice. "Mr. Whitmore does not like unnecessary conversation. Do your work, keep your head down, and if he seems distant, do not take it personally." Naomi nodded. "Has he always been like this?" The older woman's expression shifted, just barely. "No," then she walked away. Naomi spent the morning in the upstairs east wing sorting linen closets, replacing yellowed flowers in decorative vases, and opening curtains no one had bothered to touch in months. Sunlight poured through the windows in long gold sheets, catching dust in the air like floating ash. It changed the house immediately. Not enough to make it warm, but enough to remind it what warmth looked like. Around 10:30, she entered a guest bedroom and paused. There, on the dresser, sat a framed photograph someone had forgotten to turn face down. Ethan stood in a black tuxedo, younger somehow despite being only a few years earlier, his smile unguarded in a way she had not yet seen in real life. Beside him stood a woman with bright eyes and chestnut hair gathered over one shoulder, her hand resting against his chest. Beautiful, happy, alive with the kind of joy people only carried when they still believed bad things happened to other families. Naomi stared at the picture for a beat too long before gently setting it straight. Her name was Claire. Naomi turned so quickly, she nearly dropped the dust cloth in her hand. Ethan stood in the doorway, sleeves rolled to his forearms, looking not angry exactly, but caught off guard by his own decision to speak. Naomi glanced back at the photograph. She was beautiful. His jaw tightened. She hated that picture. "Why?" she asked softly before she could stop herself. Ethan stepped into the room, eyes fixed on the frame. "Because," she said, her smile looked fake. Naomi looked again. "It does not." A flicker crossed his face. Almost amusement. Almost pain. "That was the night I proposed," he said quietly. She spent the whole evening complaining her hair would not cooperate. Naomi smiled faintly. "Sounds like she was real then." Ethan let out the smallest breath through his nose. Not a laugh, but close. Then the moment vanished. He took the frame, turned it face down again, and set it back on the dresser with too much care for someone pretending not to care at all. "Do not leave personal items out," he said, voice hardening. "If I put them away, there is a reason." He walked out before she could answer. Naomi stood still for several seconds after he left. Then she looked down at the face-down photograph and whispered to the empty room. "No, there is a wound." By late afternoon, rain had begun tapping softly against the windows, and the house darkened beneath storm clouds. Naomi was organizing the library when the lights flickered once, then steadied. A moment later, she heard Ethan's voice from down the hall. Sharp, frustrated, followed by the sound of a drawer slamming. She stepped toward the doorway just as he strode past, phone in hand, shoulders rigid. "Everything all right, sir?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Ethan halted, slowly turned. For a second his expression looked almost offended that anyone had asked. Then he gave a hollow smile, so brief it barely counted. "Do I look all right, Miss Carter?" Naomi held his gaze. "No, sir." The answer landed between them like glass set carefully on stone. Ethan blinked. Most people would have lied. Most people did. His throat moved once as if swallowing something difficult. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared down the West Wing hallway, toward the white door. Naomi watched him go, rain whispering against the windows, thunder rumbling somewhere far beyond the trees. And when that door shut behind him, she understood one thing with perfect clarity. Whatever waited inside that room was not merely a memory. It was the reason the rest of him had stopped living the following morning. The rain had washed the estate clean, leaving the ground slick and shining beneath a pale silver sky. But inside the Whitmore mansion, nothing felt washed at all. The heaviness remained in the walls, in the silence between footsteps, in the way every clock seemed to tick louder than necessary. Naomi spent the first half of the day in the upstairs hallway polishing antique console tables, and dusting framed artwork no one looked at anymore. Yet her eyes kept drifting toward the west wing, toward the white door at the end of the corridor. It stayed closed all morning. Around noon, Mrs. Delaney found Naomi folding fresh towels in the linen room and said quietly, "He did not yell at you yesterday." Naomi looked up. "Should he have?" The older woman gave a dry smile. "You are still here, which means he likes you more than most." Naomi almost laughed at that. "He barely speaks to me." That is his version of progress. Mrs. Delaney adjusted the stack of towels in Naomi's arms, then lowered her voice. "Before, he used to be different. The kind of man who remembered birthdays, who brought coffee for the whole staff if the weather was bad. He built this house because his wife said she wanted children running through hallways." Naomi swallowed. "What happened?" Mrs. Delaney's face softened with old sorrow. "A drunk driver ran a red light 3 winters ago. Claire died before the ambulance reached the hospital." Naomi froze. "Oh." The woman nodded once. "Their daughter died with her. She was 6 months old." The words landed like ice water. For a moment Naomi could not speak. Suddenly the unopened mail made sense. The face-down photographs. The stale flowers. The untouched rooms. The sound of a grown man crying where no one could hear him. "That room at the end of the hall," Naomi said quietly. Mrs. Delaney's expression shifted. "Was supposed to be the nursery." Neither woman spoke for several seconds after that. Then the older woman straightened her shoulders and left. As though the memory itself had weight she could not carry long. Naomi stood frozen in the linen room, one towel still in her hands, heart aching for a man who had never once asked for her sympathy. The rest of the afternoon she moved more carefully through the mansion, as if now that she knew the truth, she owed the house a gentler touch. She passed the nursery door twice and looked away both times. But near 5 o'clock, while carrying fresh sheets toward the upstairs guest rooms, she saw it. The white door was not fully shut, just slightly ajar, barely 2 inches. She stopped walking. Her pulse kicked once against her ribs. It was not her business. She knew that. Every instinct told her to keep moving. But from where she stood, through the narrow opening, she could see the edge of a pale yellow wall painted with tiny clouds. The corner of a wooden crib. A mobile hanging perfectly still in the stale air. Something inside her chest twisted. Slowly, before she could think better of it, Naomi stepped closer. She did not enter. She only looked. The room beyond was untouched. Frozen in time. A white rocking chair by the window. Plush animals arranged in careful rows. Folded baby blankets stacked on a shelf. Tiny shoes lined beneath a changing table, as if waiting for feet that would never wear them. And on the far wall, in elegant gold script above the crib, one single word, Grace. Naomi's breath caught. "What are you doing?" The voice behind her hit like thunder. Naomi turned so fast the sheets nearly slipped from her arms. Ethan stood 10 feet away, his face drained of all color, eyes dark with something far worse than anger. Hurt. Raw, unguarded hurt. "I am sorry," she said immediately. "The door was open. I did not mean to. Get away from that room." His voice cracked on the last word. Naomi stepped back at once. "Sir, I said get away." She obeyed without another word, retreating into the hallway with her head lowered. Ethan moved past her, hand gripping the doorknob so tightly his knuckles whitened. Then he stopped, still facing the room. He said in a voice so low it was almost a whisper, "No one goes in there." Naomi swallowed hard. "I understand." He shut the door with painful care. Not a slam. Not anger. Something worse. Reverence. Like sealing a tomb. Then he turned toward her, eyes glass bright and furious with grief. "Do your job, Miss Carter. Do not make me regret hiring you." Naomi stood very still as he walked away. But long after, his footsteps disappeared downstairs. She remained in that hallway staring at the closed white door, heart heavy in her chest. Because now she knew the truth. Ethan Whitmore had not locked that room to keep others out. He had locked it because opening it meant admitting the people inside were never coming back. Naomi considered quitting that night. She sat in her car in the employee parking area with the engine off and both hands resting on the steering wheel, staring through the windshield as the last of the sunset bled orange across the estate's iron gates. She had worked in enough homes to know when grief made people cruel, and she had promised herself years ago never to stay where pain was used like a weapon. Yet when she closed her eyes, she did not see Ethan's anger. She saw the nursery. the tiny shoes beneath the changing table, the gold letters on the wall spelling out a name no one got to grow into. Grace. By morning, she was back. The mansion greeted her with the same polished silence, but something in the air felt sharper, more fragile, as though the entire house knew what had happened in that hallway. Naomi kept her distance from the West Wing and focused on the sunroom instead, sorting old magazines and wiping fingerprints from the glass doors that opened onto the garden. She had nearly finished when she noticed a tray sitting untouched on the breakfast bar. Coffee gone cold, toast barely bitten, a full plate of eggs hardened around the edges. Mrs. Delaney appeared beside her and followed her gaze. "He has not eaten properly in years," the older woman murmured. Naomi frowned. "No one says anything? To a billionaire who signs your paycheck?" Mrs. Delaney gave a tired smile. "People learn quickly what subjects are not welcome." She picked up the tray. "He works, he sleeps little, he forgets meals, and every few weeks he remembers to pretend he is fine in front of the board. That is the routine." Naomi watched her carry the tray away. Something about that image lingered all day. A man wealthy enough to buy anything and still unable to do the simplest thing a human body required to stay alive. Around 2 in the afternoon, Naomi was reorganizing the library shelves when Ethan entered without noticing her. He crossed directly to the bar cart near the fireplace, reached for a crystal decanter, and poured amber liquid into a tumbler though daylight still streamed through the windows. Naomi hesitated. Then before fear could stop her, she said softly, "That is not lunch." Ethan froze mid-pour. Slowly he turned. His expression was unreadable. "Excuse me." Naomi's pulse quickened, but she stood her ground. "I said that is not lunch, sir." For a second, she thought he might tell her to leave. Instead, his mouth twitched in something halfway between disbelief and irritation. "You are remarkably bold for someone who cleans closets." Naomi set down the book in her hands. "And you are remarkably committed to pretending whiskey counts as nutrition." Silence. Heavy, dangerous silence. Then unexpectedly, Ethan let out one short breath through his nose. Almost a laugh. He looked down at the glass. "You always speak to employers this way? Only the ones determined to collapse from stubbornness." His gaze lifted to hers. There it was again, that flicker she kept seeing beneath the grief. The man he had once been. Buried, but not gone. Ethan stared at her for a long moment before setting the tumbler down untouched. "The kitchen has soup," Naomi said quietly. "Mrs. Delaney made it this morning." He did not answer. He simply turned and walked out. Naomi exhaled, unsure whether she had just saved her job or destroyed it. 30 minutes later, she passed through the kitchen and stopped cold. Ethan sat alone at the breakfast table, jacket off, sleeves rolled, eating soup in complete silence. He did not look up when she entered. Naomi said nothing. She simply moved to the sink and began rinsing cleaning cloths, pretending not to notice him there. After several quiet minutes, his voice came low behind her. "She used to nag me about meals too." Naomi turned slightly. Ethan stared into his bowl, not at her. "Claire," he said skipping lunch made me unbearable by 3 o'clock. Naomi dried her hands slowly. "She sounds wise." A faint smile ghosted across his face, gone almost before it appeared. She was. The room fell quiet again, but this silence felt different. Softer, less like absence and more like something tentative being built. Ethan set down his spoon and rose from the table. At the doorway, he paused without turning around. "Miss Carter." "Yes, sir." "Do not mistake one conversation for permission to pry." Naomi nodded. "I would not dream of it." He left. But after he was gone, Naomi looked at the half-finished bowl of soup still warm on the table and understood something important. For the first time in years, Ethan Whitmore had allowed another person to stand near his pain without pushing them all the way out. The next few days settled into a strange rhythm neither of them acknowledged aloud. Naomi arrived each morning to a house that no longer felt quite as frozen as before, and Ethan moved through it with the wary restraint of a man who had spent so long guarding his grief that even small moments of peace made him suspicious. He still kept his distance, still spoke little, but now when she entered a room, he no longer looked startled to find another human being there. Sometimes he even stayed. On Thursday afternoon, Naomi was rearranging the books in the upstairs sitting room when Ethan appeared in the doorway holding a leather portfolio under one arm and a phone pressed between shoulder and ear. "Tell them I do not care if the investors are nervous," he snapped into the receiver. Delay the launch if legal has concerns. I will not sign something unfinished just because men in expensive suits lack patience. He ended the call with visible irritation and dropped the portfolio onto the side table harder than necessary. Papers slid halfway out. Naomi kept dusting, pretending not to notice. Ethan muttered something under his breath, knelt, and began gathering the scattered documents. One page drifted farther than the others, skidding near Naomi's shoe. She bent automatically and picked it up before he could reach it. Her eyes caught a single line before she handed it back. Construction costs. Community housing redevelopment. East Hartford District. Ethan took the paper quickly, but not before seeing the surprise on her face. You build affordable housing? She asked before she could stop herself. His expression tightened. Among other things. Naomi blinked. I thought your company only did luxury properties. Ethan straightened slowly. That is what people assume. He slid the papers back into place. Luxury developments pay for the projects that actually matter. Naomi studied him. So the billionaire everyone thinks only builds penthouses is secretly funding low-income housing. Ethan gave her a dry look. Do not sound so disappointed. I am not disappointed, she said softly. Just reconsidering my assumptions. Something shifted in his face at that. Then he surprised her by staying instead of leaving. He lowered himself into the armchair near the window with the weary movement of someone carrying more than his own weight. My father grew up in public housing, he said after a moment, staring at the rain beginning to gather against the glass. Naomi paused, cloth still in hand. He used to tell me if a man forgot where he came from, money had already ruined him. She said nothing, sensing he was not used to speaking this freely and might stop if interrupted. Ethan leaned back, gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the room. He worked 3 jobs to send me to business school. Died before he ever saw the company become what it is now. Naomi swallowed. He would have been proud of you. Ethan's laugh was soft and humorless. He would have told me to stop working 80-hour weeks and call my mother more often. That drew a real smile from her. Then yes, he sounds like a father. Ethan looked at her then, really looked. And for one suspended moment, the distance between employer and employee seemed to blur into something far more human. You do that a lot, he said quietly. Naomi frowned. Do what? See people differently than they expect. The words landed gently, but they caught her off guard. She lowered her eyes to the bookshelf. People usually show more than they think they do. Ethan studied her in silence. Then his gaze drifted to the family photograph she had placed upright on the side table 2 days earlier, and that he had not turned back over since. His jaw softened. Claire used to say that too. Naomi looked at the picture, then back at him. She must have been a good woman. His throat moved once. The best. The rain thickened outside, tapping steady against the window panes, and neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then Ethan rose from the chair, gathering his portfolio. At the doorway, he hesitated. Miss Carter. Yes. Leave the photograph there. Naomi glanced at the frame. At the smiling woman beside the version of Ethan who had still believed in forever. Then she looked back at him and nodded. Of course. He walked away before she could read the expression on his face, but after he disappeared down the hall, Naomi stood very still in the quiet room, heart beating a little faster than before. Because the man who had once turned every memory face down had just asked her to leave one standing. And sometimes healing did not begin with grand gestures. Sometimes it began with something as small as letting yourself look at love again by the second week. The mansion no longer looked like a place abandoned by the living. Fresh flowers stood in the entry hall. The curtains remained open each morning, letting sunlight spill across the marble floors instead of leaving the rooms trapped in shadow. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon instead of stale silence. Naomi never announced the changes. She simply made them, one careful detail at a time, the way spring returns to a place too slowly for anyone to notice until suddenly the trees are green again. Ethan noticed. He noticed every single thing. He did not always comment, but Naomi could feel it in the way his eyes lingered when he entered a room, in the way he no longer shut himself in his office the moment she arrived, in the way his shoulders had begun, little by little, to lower from around his ears. That Friday evening, thunder rolled in low over the estate, and Naomi stayed later than usual to finish reorganizing the downstairs study before the weekend. Most of the staff had already gone home. The house was nearly silent except for rain drumming softly against the windows and the faint crackle of the fireplace Ethan had lit an hour earlier. Naomi was stacking old financial records into storage boxes when she heard him speak from behind her. "You moved the armchair." She turned. Ethan stood near the doorway, tie loosened, jacket off, one hand tucked into his pocket. His eyes drifted toward the reading chair she had angled closer to the fireplace. "It looked lonely facing the wall," Naomi said. For a second, he just stared at the chair. Then, unexpectedly, he crossed the room and lowered himself into it. He looked around slowly, taking in the study as if seeing it for the first time. "Claire used to sit there when I worked late," he said quietly. "She would read and complain that I cared more about contracts than sleep." Naomi smiled faintly while folding another stack of papers. "Did she ever win that argument?" Ethan's mouth curved. "Rarely." The smile faded as quickly as it came. "She was always trying to make this place feel less like a museum." Naomi stopped moving. "Maybe she would like what it looks like now." Ethan looked into the fire. "Maybe." Silence settled between them, warm this time, softened by rain and flame and the strange intimacy of two people speaking in a room too quiet for lies. Then Ethan said, without warning, "Why do you do this?" Naomi glanced up. "Clean houses." No, his gaze lifted to hers. "This." He gestured vaguely between them. "You speak to me like I am not impossible to be around. You keep fixing things no one asked you to fix. Most people in this house walk on glass around me." Naomi lowered the folder in her hands. She could have laughed it off, could have changed the subject. Instead, she answered honestly, "Because I know what grief looks like when it starts swallowing someone whole." Ethan went still. The fire popped softly in the hearth. "You speak from experience," he said. It was not a question. Naomi looked down at her hands. Her voice came quieter when she answered. "My son died when he was 8. The room seemed to inhale around them. Ethan did not move, did not blink. Naomi swallowed past the sudden tightness in her throat. "Leukemia," she said softly. "He fought for 2 years. Brave the whole time." She smiled faintly through the ache. "Braver than I was." Ethan stared at her as if the floor beneath him had shifted. "I did not know," he said, and for once there was no authority in his voice, no distance. Just stunned humanity. Naomi gave a small shrug. "Most people do not ask." The words hung there. Heavy, honest. Ethan's eyes dropped, and something in his face changed then, some final piece of assumption breaking apart. "And you still come in here every day," he said quietly, "into a house filled with reminders of loss." Naomi met his gaze. "Pain recognizes pain, Mr. Whitmore." The fire crackled. Rain slid down the windows in silver lines. Ethan looked at her for so long she felt the air change around them. Then he asked, voice rougher than before, "How did you survive it?" Naomi held his eyes and answered with the truth she had learned the hard way. "I did. Not at first." Ethan's breath caught. "Then how are you standing here?" Naomi looked toward the rain-streaked glass, then back at him. "Because eventually I learned surviving grief does not mean getting over it." Her voice softened. "It means carrying it differently." Ethan said nothing after that. He only stared into the fire, eyes shining with thoughts too deep for words. And for the first time since she had met him, Naomi saw it clearly. The walls around Ethan Whitmore were not just cracking anymore. They were beginning to fall. The conversation in the study changed something neither of them named. After that night, Ethan no longer treated Naomi like part of the furniture or a necessary service moving quietly through the background of his life. He began lingering when she worked nearby, asking small questions in that careful, hesitant way people did when they were not sure whether they still remembered how to connect. What music did she like? Where had she grown up? Did she always want to do this kind of work? Naomi answered when she chose to and deflected when she did not. And somehow that unspoken balance between honesty and restraint made them trust each other more. By Monday, even Mrs. Delaney noticed. "He asked if you had taken your lunch break," the older woman said while polishing silver in the kitchen, looking half scandalized and half delighted. Naomi blinked. "He what?" "Mr. Whitmore has not concerned himself with another person's lunch in 3 years." Naomi laughed softly, but her heart warmed in a way she did not expect. That afternoon, she was trimming fresh hydrangeas for the dining room when Ethan entered the kitchen with his sleeves rolled and his tie hanging loose around his collar. "I need your opinion," he said. Naomi looked up in surprise. On what? He set 2 fabric swatches on the counter. Boardroom renovation. My design team insists on beige. I think beige is where good taste goes to die. Naomi stared at him for one beat, then burst into laughter before she could stop herself. Ethan's mouth twitched. I assume that means you agree? She picked up the swatches. This one, she said, holding up the darker charcoal option. The beige looks like a dentist's waiting room. Ethan nodded solemnly. Exactly what I told them. He took the swatch back, but instead of leaving, he remained there, watching her arrange flowers. Claire used to do that, he said after a moment. Naomi glanced up. Arrange flowers? Every Monday. His eyes drifted to the vase in her hands. She said fresh flowers made a house remember it was alive. Naomi swallowed around the lump suddenly rising in her throat. She sounds like someone I would have liked. Ethan looked at the hydrangeas for a long time. She would have liked you too. The words came so quietly Naomi almost missed them. For a second neither moved. Then the front door opened somewhere down the hall, followed by sharp footsteps clicking across marble. A woman in a cream coat swept into the kitchen without knocking, her blonde hair perfectly styled and her diamond earrings flashing beneath the pendant lights. She stopped short when she saw Naomi standing beside Ethan. Her eyes flicked over Naomi's cleaning apron, then narrowed almost imperceptibly. Ethan, she said, with the polished brightness of someone used to being welcomed everywhere. You did not answer my texts. Ethan's posture changed instantly, shoulders stiffening, voice cooling. Vanessa. Naomi stepped back instinctively, sensing tension she did not understand. Vanessa's gaze slid toward her again. I did not realize staff joined you in the kitchen now. The sentence was smooth enough to sound harmless. The tone was not. Ethan's jaw hardened. Miss Carter was helping me with something. Vanessa smiled without warmth. How progressive. Naomi lowered her eyes and returned to the flowers, pretending not to hear. But she felt every word like a change in air pressure. Vanessa crossed to Ethan, dropping her voice though not enough to keep Naomi from hearing. Your mother is asking if you are attending the gala Friday. She says people are beginning to talk. Ethan's expression darkened. Then tell my mother people should get hobbies. Vanessa sighed dramatically. You cannot hide in this house forever because you are sad. The room went still. Naomi froze with pruning shears in hand. Ethan's voice dropped low enough to cut glass. Leave. Vanessa blinked. Excuse me. I said leave, Vanessa. The woman stared at him, stunned. Then her gaze snapped toward Naomi, as if somehow this humiliation were her fault. Her lips thinned. I see, she said coolly. Apparently your household help has become very influential. She turned and walked out, heels striking the marble like punctuation. Silence swallowed the kitchen after she left. Naomi. Set down the flowers carefully. I can go if you need. No, Ethan's voice was immediate. He exhaled hard, rubbing one hand across his face. No. Stay. He stood there for a moment, breathing through anger and something deeper beneath it. Then, without looking at her, he said quietly, she was my mother's idea after Claire died. Naomi understood at once. The polished friend. The socially acceptable replacement. The woman everyone thought he should choose to move on. You do not love her, Naomi said softly. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. I barely tolerate her. Then he looked at Naomi with an honesty so naked it made the room feel smaller. She keeps trying to convince everyone grief has an expiration date. Naomi held his gaze and answered gently, it does not. Something in Ethan's face softened then, all the anger draining into weariness. No, he murmured. It does not. And standing there beneath the kitchen lights, with rain clouds gathering outside the windows and fresh flowers between them on the counter, Naomi realized the most dangerous thing of all was beginning to happen. Ethan Whitmore was no longer just healing in her presence. He was beginning to need it. The rest of the week passed beneath a tension neither of them acknowledged aloud. After Vanessa's visit, Ethan became quieter again, though not closed off the way he had been before. It was a different kind of silence now, less like distance, more like a man wrestling with thoughts he did not yet trust himself to say. Naomi understood that kind of silence. She did not press. She simply kept working, moving through the mansion with her usual steady grace, polishing silver, replacing flowers, folding life back into rooms that had forgotten how to feel lived in. Friday evening arrived wrapped in cold rain and gray skies, the kind of weather that made the whole estate look like a painting left too long in shadow. Naomi was gathering her coat to leave when Mrs. Delaney entered the mudroom carrying an umbrella. "He is not going," she muttered. Naomi frowned. "To the gala?" The older woman nodded. "His mother has called 3 times. Board members are there. Investors are there. If he skips it again, the gossip will worsen." Naomi hesitated, then glanced toward the front hall, where Ethan stood near the staircase in a black tuxedo, tie undone, jacket draped over. One arm as though he had dressed for battle and lost the will to fight. His face was pale with that familiar emptiness she had come to recognize as the edge of a spiral. Without fully thinking it through, Naomi crossed the foyer. "Mr. Whitmore." He looked up slowly. "What? Go." His brow furrowed. "Excuse me." Naomi folded her arms. "Go to the gala." Ethan stared at her as if she had spoken another language. "Absolutely not." "Why?" "Because I have no interest in spending 4 hours pretending I enjoy champagne and meaningless conversation with people who only respect my bank account." Naomi held his gaze. "Then do not go for them." He gave a humorless laugh. "That is not exactly persuasive." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Go because hiding in this house is not the same thing as healing." The words landed hard. Ethan's face changed instantly. Hurt flickered behind his eyes before irritation covered it. "You assume quite a lot for someone employed to clean my floors." Naomi stiffened. The sentence hit sharper than he intended. She could see the regret in his face the moment it left his mouth. But it was too late. The old walls were up again. The old distance. Naomi nodded once, every trace of warmth leaving her expression. "Then forgive me for overstepping, sir." She picked up her coat and walked toward the door. "Naomi," he stopped himself. Pride, grief, fear, whatever it was, it won. He said nothing else. Naomi left without turning around. The rain outside was cold enough to sting, and by the time she reached her car her hands were shaking, though she could not tell if it was from weather or disappointment. She had known better than to believe progress meant safety. Wounded people often struck hardest when someone got too close. Back inside the mansion, Ethan stood alone in the foyer long after the door shut behind her. The house felt immediately different. Quieter. Colder. The silence he had once preferred now pressed against his ears like punishment. His eyes drifted to the fresh flowers on the entry table, the open curtains, the framed photographs left standing where she had placed them, evidence of her in every softened corner. He looked down at the tuxedo still hanging from his hand, then toward the front door, then toward the dark reflection of himself in the foyer mirror. A man in expensive clothes standing in a beautiful house, looking emptier than ever. An hour later, Naomi was halfway through reheating leftovers in her apartment when someone knocked at her door. She frowned, set down the spoon, and opened it. Ethan Whitmore stood in the hallway in full black tie, rainwater darkening the shoulders of his coat, hair damp from the storm, breathing slightly harder than he should have been. Naomi blinked in shock. "What are you doing here?" Ethan looked at her for one long, unguarded second. Then he said the words like they cost him something. "Apologizing." Naomi stared. He swallowed. "You were right. And I was cruel because being right terrified me." Rain tapped against the apartment building windows behind him. His voice dropped lower. "Every time you tell me the truth, it feels like you are pulling me toward a life I do not know how to live anymore." Naomi's anger softened despite herself. "Ethan, no," he said gently. "Let me finish before I lose the nerve." His eyes held hers with a vulnerability so naked it almost hurt to witness. "I do not want to become the kind of man who punishes the only person who has been brave enough to care whether I heal." Silence stretched between them. Then Naomi looked at the tuxedo, at the damp shoulders of his coat, at the billionaire standing in her apartment hallway apologizing like a man and not a title. And very softly, she asked, "Did you go to the gala?" Ethan's mouth curved faintly. "Not yet." Naomi raised one eyebrow. "Then what are you doing standing here?" For the first time in weeks, Ethan smiled fully, warmly, almost boyishly, waiting for my conscience to tell me whether I have been forgiven. And standing there in the yellow light of her tiny apartment doorway, Naomi felt it with sudden, terrifying clarity. Somewhere between grief and healing, the line between them had begun to blur into something neither of them could keep pretending not to feel. The rest of the week passed beneath a tension neither of them acknowledged aloud. After Vanessa's visit, Ethan became quieter again, though not closed off the way he had been before. It was a different kind of silence now, less like distance, more like a man wrestling with thoughts he did not yet trust himself to say. Naomi understood that kind of silence. She did not press. She simply kept working, moving through the mansion with her usual steady grace, polishing silver, replacing flowers, folding life back into rooms that had forgotten how to feel lived in. Friday evening arrived wrapped in cold rain and gray skies, the kind of weather that made the whole estate look like a painting left too long in shadow. Naomi was gathering her coat to leave when Mrs. Delaney entered the mudroom, carrying an umbrella. "He is not going," she muttered. Naomi frowned. "To the gala?" The older woman nodded. "His mother has called 3 times. Board members are there. Investors are there. If he skips it again, the gossip will worsen." Naomi hesitated, then glanced toward the front hall, where Ethan stood near the staircase in a black tuxedo, tie undone, jacket draped over one arm, as though he had dressed for battle and lost the will to fight. His face was pale with that familiar emptiness she had come to recognize as the edge of a spiral. Without fully thinking it through, Naomi crossed the foyer. "Mr. Whitmore." He looked up slowly. "What? Go." His brow furrowed. "Excuse me." Naomi folded her arms. "Go to the gala." Ethan stared at her as if she had spoken another language. "Absolutely not." "Why?" "Because I have no interest in spending 4 hours pretending I enjoy champagne and meaningless conversation with people who only respect my bank account." Naomi held his gaze. "Then do not go for them." He gave a humorless laugh. "That is not exactly persuasive." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Go because hiding in this house is not the same thing as healing." The words landed hard. Ethan's face changed instantly. Hurt flickered behind his eyes before irritation covered it. "You assume quite a lot for someone employed to clean my floors." Naomi stiffened. The sentence hit sharper than he intended. She could see the regret in his face the moment it left his mouth. But it was too late. The old walls were up again. The old distance. Naomi nodded once, every trace of warmth leaving her expression. "Then forgive me for overstepping, sir." She picked up her coat and walked toward the door. "Naomi," he stopped himself. Pride, grief, fear, whatever it was, it won. He said nothing else. Naomi left without turning around. The rain outside was cold enough to sting, and by the time she reached her car her hands were shaking, though she could not tell if it was from weather or disappointment. She had known better than to believe progress meant safety. Wounded people often struck hardest when someone got too close. Back inside the mansion, Ethan stood alone in the foyer long after the door shut behind her. The house felt immediately different. Quieter, colder. The silence he had once preferred now pressed against his ears like punishment. His eyes drifted to the fresh flowers on the entry table, the open curtains, the framed photographs left standing where she had placed them, evidence of her in every softened corner. He looked down at the tuxedo still hanging from his hand, then toward the front door, then toward the dark reflection of himself in the foyer mirror, a man in expensive clothes standing in a beautiful house, looking emptier than ever. An hour later, Naomi was halfway through reheating leftovers in her apartment when someone knocked at her door. She frowned, set down the spoon, and opened it. Ethan Whitmore stood in the hallway in full black tie, rainwater darkening the shoulders of his coat, hair damp from the storm, breathing slightly harder than he should have been. Naomi blinked in shock. "What are you doing here?" Ethan looked at her for one long, unguarded second. Then he said the words like they cost him something. "Apologizing." Naomi stared. He swallowed. "You were right. And I was cruel because being right terrified me." Rain tapped against the apartment building windows behind him. His voice dropped lower. "Every time you tell me the truth, it feels like you are pulling me toward a life I do not know how to live anymore." Naomi's anger softened despite herself. "Ethan, no," he said gently. "Let me finish before I lose the nerve." His eyes held hers with a vulnerability so naked it almost hurt to witness. "I do not want to become the kind of man who punishes the only person who has been brave enough to care whether I heal." Silence stretched between them. Then Naomi looked at the tuxedo, at the damp shoulders of his coat, at the billionaire standing in her apartment hallway apologizing like a man and not a title. And very softly, she asked, "Did you go to the gala?" Ethan's mouth curved faintly. "Not yet." Naomi raised one eyebrow. "Then what are you doing standing here?" For the first time in weeks, Ethan smiled fully, warmly, almost boyishly, waiting for my conscience to tell me whether I have been forgiven. And standing there in the yellow light of her tiny apartment doorway, Naomi felt it with sudden, terrifying clarity. Somewhere between grief and healing, the line between them had begun to blur into something neither of them could keep pretending not to feel. Monday arrived with a tension so delicate Naomi could feel it the moment she stepped through the front door. The mansion looked brighter than ever, sunlight pouring through polished windows, fresh flowers blooming in every room, the quiet no longer hollow, but almost peaceful. Yet Ethan was nowhere to be found. Mrs. Delaney informed Naomi he had left before dawn for meetings in Boston and had not said when he would return. Naomi nodded as if that did not bother her, then spent the morning pretending not to glance toward the driveway every 20 minutes. He did not come home for lunch. He did not call down from his office. He did not wander into the kitchen with some half-serious complaint designed only to keep talking to her. The absence sat heavier than she expected. By late afternoon, Naomi was in the upstairs hallway replacing linens when she heard voices downstairs. Sharp, formal, more than one. She moved toward the landing and looked down into the foyer. Ethan stood near the staircase with 3 men in tailored suits and one older woman wearing pearls and enough disapproval to chill the room by 10 degrees. Even from above, Naomi recognized his mother immediately. She had Ethan's eyes, though hers held none of his softness. "This is not acceptable, Ethan," the woman was saying. "Investors are already asking questions about your focus." "My focus is fine," Ethan replied flatly. "Then stop giving them reasons to doubt it." Her gaze shifted then, upward, landing directly on Naomi at the top of the stairs. The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. "And perhaps stop encouraging gossip." Ethan followed her stare. The second he saw Naomi, his jaw tightened. "That will be enough, mother." But the older woman ignored him. Her voice rose just enough to ensure Naomi heard every word. "Your staff has become far too comfortable in this household. It is inappropriate. People are talking." The foyer went still. Ethan's face darkened, with immediate anger. "You do not speak about her that way." The woman blinked, clearly unused to being corrected. "I beg your pardon. You heard me." His voice was low and dangerous. "Miss Carter has done more to restore this house than anyone else in 3 years, and I will not stand here while you reduce her to gossip because you cannot control every aspect of my life." Naomi's breath caught. One of the suited men looked at the floor, pretending not to exist. Ethan's mother straightened, stunned into silence for half a second before her face hardened. "You are embarrassing yourself." Ethan gave a bitter laugh. "No. I have spent years embarrassing myself by letting everyone decide how long I was allowed to grieve and who I was supposed to become after it." The room seemed to shrink around the force of his voice. "That ends now." His mother stared at him as if seeing a stranger. Then, with cold dignity, she turned and walked toward the door. The men followed without a word. The moment the front door shut, silence crashed into the foyer. Ethan stood motionless, shoulders rigid, hands clenched at his sides. Naomi descended the stairs slowly. "You did not have to do that," she said softly. Ethan let out a breath that sounded almost shaky. "Yes," he said. "I did." He turned to face her, and whatever adrenaline had fueled him moments before was gone now, leaving only exhaustion and raw honesty. "I am tired of people treating the best thing that has happened to me in years like something shameful." Naomi's heart stopped for one terrible, beautiful second. Ethan seemed to realize what he had just admitted. But this time, he did not retreat from it. He stepped closer instead. "I tried to ignore what I am feeling," he said quietly. "I told myself it was grief, dependence, gratitude, anything but this." Naomi's pulse thundered in her ears. "Ethan, but every room in this house feels different when you are in it." His voice dropped lower, rougher. "And every time you leave, I count the hours until you come back." The space between them narrowed to breath and heartbeat. Naomi looked up at him, eyes wide, heart breaking open in slow motion. "You are still healing," she whispered. "I know. And I cannot be the reason you forget what Claire meant to you." His gaze softened with a depth that nearly undid her. "You are not replacing her, Naomi." The words came gentle and certain. "You are reminding me that my heart did not die with her." Tears burned suddenly behind Naomi's eyes. Neither of them moved. Neither dared close the final inch between them. But standing in the center of the mansion she had brought back to life, Naomi realized the truth had finally surfaced between them, undeniable and trembling. What had begun as healing had become something far more dangerous. Because now Ethan Whitmore was not just learning how to live again. He was learning who he wanted to live for. Neither of them moved for what felt like an entire lifetime. The mansion stood silent around them, sunlight spilling across the marble floor, dust motes drifting in the stillness between two people balanced on the edge of something neither had planned and neither could deny. Ethan's confession hung in the air like a held breath. Naomi could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. She wanted to step closer, wanted to believe life could be cruel enough to break hearts and kind enough to let them love again anyway. But wanting and wisdom were not always the same thing. Slowly, she took one step back. The change in Ethan's face was immediate. Not anger, not frustration, just hurt so quiet it made her chest ache. "Naomi," he said softly. She shook her head, eyes glistening. "Please do not misunderstand me." Her voice trembled despite her effort to steady it. "What I feel for you is real." Ethan's breath caught. "Then why are you stepping away?" Naomi swallowed hard. "Because I know what grief can do when it dresses itself up as love before it is ready." Silence. Sharp and painful. Ethan stared at her as if trying to understand whether she was protecting herself or him. The truth was both. "You have come so far," she whispered. "But you are still standing in the wreckage, Ethan. If we cross this line now, and you realize later you were only reaching for the first warmth you felt after the cold," she blinked back tears. "I could survive heartbreak. I have survived worse. But I could not survive becoming the thing you used to avoid finishing your healing." His face tightened, every muscle in it straining under the weight of words he did not want to hear because part of him knew she was right. Naomi stepped closer again then, enough that her voice dropped to almost nothing. "If this is real, if what you feel for me is still here when your heart is no longer bleeding quite so hard," her eyes held his, "then I will be here." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, pain and understanding warring behind his eyes. Then he gave one slow, defeated nod. "You always know exactly where to cut through my excuses." Naomi let out a shaky laugh through tears. "Occupational hazard." For a second his mouth almost smiled. Then his gaze drifted past her shoulder, toward the West Wing hallway, toward the white door still closed at the end of it. Something in his expression changed. Quietly, he said, "There is one thing I still have not done." Naomi followed his eyes and felt her breath catch. "The nursery," she whispered. Ethan nodded. His throat worked once. "I have not walked into that room since the funeral." Naomi turned slowly toward the hallway, then back to him. "Why are you telling me this?" His eyes found hers again. "Because I think I finally want to." The words were barely audible. Fear lived in every syllable. Naomi's heart broke open all over again. She did not answer with words. She simply reached for his hand. Ethan looked down at their joined hands like he had forgotten human touch could be gentle. Then together, step by step, they walked down the West Wing hallway. The house seemed to hold its breath around them. At the nursery door, Ethan stopped. His hand trembled visibly as he reached for the knob. Naomi squeezed his fingers once. "You do not have to do this today." He swallowed. "Yes," he whispered. "I do." Slowly, he turned the handle. The door creaked open. Dusty sunlight spilled across pale yellow walls and frozen memories. The rocking chair. The crib. The blankets folded exactly where they had been left. Ethan stood in the doorway and stopped breathing. Naomi remained beside him, silent, her hand still in his. One step, then another. Ethan entered the room like a man walking into sacred ground. His eyes moved over every untouched detail, every dream preserved in stillness. Then they landed on the crib. His shoulders broke. He bent forward, one hand covering his mouth as the first shattered sob escaped him. Naomi moved without hesitation, wrapping both arms around him as grief hit him full force. He clung to her like a drowning man, years of restrained sorrow finally breaking loose in the room where he had left it buried. She held him while he cried, held him while his knees nearly gave out, held him while the mansion stood silent around them, and the afternoon light poured gold through nursery curtains that had not been opened in years. And in that room, surrounded by the life he had lost and the future he had feared to face, Ethan Whitmore finally did the one thing grief had never let him do before. He let himself mourn completely. He cried until there was nothing elegant left in him. No polished restraint. No billionaire composure. Just a broken man kneeling beside a crib built for a daughter who never came home, shaking with grief he had delayed for 3 unbearable years. Naomi stayed with him through all of it. She did not interrupt, did not offer hollow comfort. She simply held him and let him break, because sometimes love looked less like fixing and more like refusing to leave when someone fell apart. By the time his breathing finally slowed, the late afternoon sun had shifted gold across the nursery floor. Ethan sat in the rocking chair now, elbows on his knees, face pale and raw, while Naomi knelt beside him with one hand resting lightly over his. For a long time neither spoke. Then Ethan looked around the room again, eyes swollen but clearer than she had ever seen them. "I thought if I kept this room untouched," he said quietly, "it meant I was still keeping them close." Naomi squeezed his hand gently. "That is what grief tells us." His throat tightened. "But all I really did was trap them in the worst moment of my life." Tears burned behind Naomi's eyes. Ethan stood slowly and crossed to the crib, resting one hand on the rail with reverence. "Claire used to come in here every night," he murmured, a fragile smile ghosting across his face. "Even before Grace was born. She would sit in that chair and read children's books out loud because she said our daughter needed to hear how much she was loved before she ever arrived." Naomi pressed a hand to her mouth, heart aching at the image. Ethan looked toward the bookshelf near the window, where a row of untouched picture books still stood in perfect order. Then, after a long breath, he walked to it and pulled one free. He turned it over in his hands as if touching memory itself. "I think," he said, voice rough but steadier now, "it is time this room becomes something other than a shrine." Naomi rose slowly. "What do you mean?" Ethan looked around at the yellow walls, the untouched toys, the blankets folded by hands that were no longer here. "There is a children's wing at St. Mary's Hospital downtown." He swallowed once. "They lost funding for their reading program last year." Naomi stared at him. His eyes met hers, vulnerable and certain all at once. "Claire would hate that these books are gathering dust while children who are fighting for their lives have nothing." Emotion closed Naomi's throat. "You want to donate them?" He nodded. "The books, the toys, the furniture." His voice softened. "Everything that can help another child feel loved." A tear slipped down Naomi's cheek before she could stop it. Ethan stepped closer. "I am not giving them away because I love them less," he whispered. "I am giving them away because I finally understand loving them means letting what they gave me keep living." Naomi broke then, tears falling freely as she smiled through them. "That is healing, Ethan." He looked at her with something almost like wonder. "No," he said quietly. "That is what you taught me healing looks like." Silence stretched between them, full and golden and trembling with all the things still unsaid. Ethan lifted one hand and brushed a tear from her cheek with such tenderness it stole the breath from her lungs. "You were right before," he murmured. "I was not ready." Naomi held perfectly still beneath his touch. "And now?" His eyes locked to hers, clearer than they had been at any point since she met him. "Now I know the difference between reaching for someone because I am broken," his thumb lingered gently against her skin, "and loving someone because they help me remember who I am when I am whole." Naomi's breath caught. Every warning she had given him, every wall she had forced between them for his sake, all of it shattered beneath the truth in his eyes. "Naomi," he whispered, voice trembling in the smallest way, "I do not need you because I am grieving anymore." His forehead nearly touched hers. "I need you because I love you." The room seemed to stop around them. Sunlight poured through the nursery windows in soft gold streams. Dust danced in the air like blessings. Naomi looked at the man in front of her, the man who had once hidden from pain behind locked doors and cold silence, the man now standing in the very center of his deepest wound with open eyes and an open heart, and she knew. He was not reaching for her out of emptiness anymore. He was reaching for her because he was ready. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she smiled, the kind of smile that only comes when a heart finally stops bracing for loss. "Then kiss me," she whispered. And this time, when Ethan Whitmore stepped forward, neither of them stepped away. The kiss was not rushed. It was not reckless. It was the kind of kiss that only happens when two people have stood at the edge of heartbreak long enough to understand what it means to choose tenderness anyway. Ethan touched her as if she were something precious. Naomi held him as if she had known all along this was where they were heading and had simply been waiting for his heart to catch up. When they finally pulled apart, the nursery stood glowing around them in late afternoon light. No longer a tomb, but something softer now. Something sacred, something healed. Ethan rested his forehead against hers, smiling the quiet, disbelieving smile of a man who had not expected life to hand him joy again. "I hired you to organize my house," he murmured. Naomi laughed through tears. "And instead I rearranged your entire existence. Completely." He kissed her forehead, and the warmth of it settled deep into the places in her that had once believed love after loss belonged only to other people. The weeks that followed did not unfold like a fairy tale. Healing never did. There were still hard mornings. Still nights when Ethan woke from dreams with grief sitting heavy on his chest. Still moments when Naomi's own memories of her son returned sharp enough to steal breath from her lungs. But now neither of them carried pain alone. The nursery furniture was donated to St. Mary's within the month. Ethan attended in person when the children's wing reopened the reading room funded in Claire and Grace's names. Naomi stood beside him as children climbed onto beanbags and reached for storybooks that had once sat untouched in a silent mansion. Ethan cried quietly when he saw a little girl in pigtails hugging the stuffed rabbit that had belonged to Grace. This time he did not hide the tears. He simply reached for Naomi's hand and held on. Spring came slowly to the Whitmore estate. The gardens bloomed. Windows stayed open. Laughter returned to hallways that had forgotten how to carry it. Staff no longer whispered in fear when Ethan entered a room because the man walking those floors now smiled more than he frowned. He asked people how their families were. He remembered birthdays again. He even called his mother more often, though he had learned to end those conversations the moment judgment entered them. And one warm evening in early May, Ethan stood in the kitchen while Naomi arranged flowers at the counter. Just as she had the day, everything changed, and he wrapped his arms around her from behind with the ease of someone who no longer feared happiness enough to hold it at a distance. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. He rested his chin against her shoulder and looked out at the golden lights spilling across the gardens. "How close I came," he murmured, "to spending the rest of my life in a beautiful house that felt like a grave." Naomi turned in his arms. "And now?" Ethan looked at her the way men look at miracles they know they did not earn, but intend to cherish anyway. "Now it feels like home." Months later, Mrs. Delaney would tell new staff the story in quiet, half-amused tones whenever they asked why the master of the house smiled every time the woman beside him entered a room. She would glance toward the sunlit foyer, where Ethan and Naomi often stood together in the mornings sharing coffee before work, and say, "She was hired to put his mansion in order." Then she would smile softly and add, "But what she really did was remind a broken man that grief is not where love goes to die." And on certain evenings, when the house grew quiet and the windows glowed warm against the dark, Ethan would walk past the room that had once remained locked for years. The nursery door now stood open. Empty, yes, but no longer untouched, no longer frozen. On the shelf by the window remained one single framed photograph. Claire smiling beside him, one hand over the swell of her pregnant stomach. Not hidden, not face down, honored, loved, remembered, because Naomi had taught him something no wealth, no therapy, no time alone had ever managed to teach. That moving forward was not betrayal. That opening his heart again did not erase the people he lost. It simply proved love had survived them. And sometimes, late at night, when the mansion had gone still and Naomi slept warm beside him, Ethan would lie awake for a moment listening to her breathe.